how can communication service providers best use open source development and deployment models? And how does the increasing visibility and viability of open source software impact how CSPs and their suppliers do business? Well, helping us to gain a better understanding of the open source model for CSPs are Geoff Hollingworth, Chief Marketing Officer at MobiledgeX, and joining from New Hampshire is Tom Nadeau, Director of NFV Software Engineering at Red Hat. And joining from Menlo Park in California is Timon Sloane, Head of Ecosystem and Marketing with the ONF. Gentlemen, thank you all for joining us on Telecom TV. First question first. How does open source benefit CSPs? Does it really result in lower equipment and development costs? Tom, can I ask you this one first? How open source has a benefit?
I think it depends on what kind of CSP we're talking about. People like to group them together, but I think there's a significant difference, especially when it comes to open source, when you're talking about tier 1 versus 2 or 3, and a lot of that comes down to available resources, corporate structure, corporate culture, things like that.
Well, it's a very good point, and we'll get on to how the different size CSPs can benefit in a moment. Timon, if I can talk to you, the ONF is a CSP-led organization that leans heavily on open source, as its name suggests. What's your view?
So you're right. So the ONF is led by a number of tier 1 operators from around the world, and our view is a bit different. You asked the question about whether open source helps with cost. You jumped there, and I would say that yes, cost. There are benefits there, but really it's around control and about being able to chart their own destiny. That the operators have for some time become too reliant on the incumbent vendors, and the number of vendors has consolidated dramatically over the years. And this is a period in history when the operators are really trying to change course and try to start to control their own networks, drive their own destiny, and to learn as much as they can from the cloud operators and to incorporate all those kinds of approaches to building their own infrastructure. And open source is a key and critical component of that.
And Geoff, MobiledgeX is heavily involved in organizations such as TIP, LF Edge. How do you see open source as benefiting CSPs?
Well, I think open source represents a new way to develop software and collaborate that originally perhaps was counterintuitive to a community, and now people see that by opening up and sharing, you get a better quality. I think that the question is what better software does when you put it inside an operation. So it's not the total answer to complete production and complete success, but from a software development point of view, we are open sourcing, and we benefit greatly from being a part of the Linux Foundation and TIP and other activities, definitely.
Tom, there's a model associated with open source communities and a way of working that is often very different from the traditional standards and vendor approach that telcos have been used to for decades now. Is there anything that CSPs need to know about this model and how it's different?
Yeah, and I think, again, it gets back to what I said at the beginning. It differs depending on their size and scale. So for the larger tier 1 SPs, you can see in the industry today, they have enough resources where they can spend money investing in developers, hiring developers, and they're able to actually build some of the tools and applications that they've been paying other vendors in the past to develop. That differs with the tier 2 and tier 3s a little bit in that they're often more limited in that regard, and so there's more of a consultative integration situation. Although there's still a lot of benefits there, as was just mentioned. In how those things are developed, how they're customized, how requirements are conveyed. And for example, the ONF is doing a lot of work in that regard to gather those requirements and then help the community sort of build the right things.
Timon, you mentioned that ONF was created by a group of tier one operators. How easy or difficult has it been challenging for them to come to terms with this way of working?
It's been a fascinating journey, and it's challenging. It's not about coming to terms, but it's about finding a way to navigate through this really interesting period in time, more than anything, I would say. That we kind of recognized a problem up front, and the problem is really simple, that operators are essentially going to go out of business if they can't find a way to adjust. The ARPU, the revenue is roughly flat, and the bandwidth demands continue to go, double and double and double, and costs continue to rise. And so something has to change. And so, that really drove a set of operators embracing, frankly, when the ONF started, it was kind of a risk bet. Like, let's try and figure out if we can use open source and come together as a community to try and drive some change. That was, at this point, more than 8 years ago, and it's been, a fascinating journey. At this point in time, the operators clearly see the advantages, and some really significant things are happening. Even just this last week at the ONF Connect event, where Comcast came out publicly saying they have open source in production at scale and rolling. AT&T, Deutsche Telekom, Telefonica published a report that's with AD Little that comes out publicly and says, you asked about cost up front, 40% CapEx and 25% OpEx from a pretty exhaustive model looking at using open source in their access and edge networks. And so, at this point in time, the benefits are really clear. The traction is really there. But the most complicated part is still figuring out how to put the whole pieces together. And you were asking about that, and we can get into that more. Building a community to help build these solutions.
Well, we'll pick up on that one. Geoff, end of the day, this is about operationalizing this open source and actually putting it into commercial use.
Yeah, and building on what Timon said there has to be changes inside the telecom community to cope with ever-growing scale and increasing operation and finding new revenue. Open source is a really big tool to enable that. You still need to be able to deliver a commercial service that meets what your customers need, and it needs to work. So putting the pieces together where time to market is increasing, collaboration is increasing, it's a very interesting time for telecom to actually be starting to become more proactive in this world.
Yeah, and Tom, I'm sure you're seeing this in NFV, this coming together of the two sides and this establishment of an ecosystem and maybe changing the nature of this ecosystem.
Yeah, in that context, one of the biggest challenges these days is you kind of touched on that just now, Geoff, around testing and integration, and this kind of ties into an understanding of how open source actually works today. And there's I've worked with a lot of CSPs in the past and currently, and one of those is around education, that upstream code is generally not available, or is not designed really to be deployed in production immediately. There's customization that needs to happen, there's packaging, there's things like that, and also testing. And testing is a real challenge these days, both at Red Hat and in the industry around this specific space with CSPs, because they have a traditional model, and we're trying to sort of move that forward into what we have today.
One of the things I've seen out of the ONF, Timon, if I can just come to you now, that's intriguing is this idea of curated open source, kind of CSP-led reference designs. Can you just explain a bit more about that?
Sure. So, what we were experiencing on this journey is that, when we started, there was no open source in networking. And then, there were 2 or 3 projects, and then suddenly there was this huge proliferation of projects. And it became quite confusing for the industry. And the need or the complexity of putting it all together was not to be underestimated, and picking the right parts and whatnot. And there's a recognition that we need critical mass to pull this off, and the operators really need to come together They don't individually have quite the buying power of some of the cloud operators for some of the pieces, and but by coming together, they can they form essentially that buying power and that market muscle, and really importantly also guide the industry so that the vendors know where to invest, that they recognize if they invest in a certain solution that they're going to be operators ready and willing and with money ready to consume. So the ONF went about this about a year and a half ago. We launched a whole new strategic plan and a whole new structure that was based on this whole notion of curated open source that we had been developing for some time, and also something we call reference designs, where the operators come together and specify how the pieces will fit together. It's a specification, but they commit to actually purchasing off of it, that RFPs will refer back to it. And the intention there is quite clear. It's to show the industry where they're going and to try to give vendors comfort that if they invest in certain solutions, that they'll know there'll be a market there. And again, all around building critical mass and trying to build some alignment in the industry and clarity for the industry.
And Tom, we've got a lot of initiatives been led by a number of the larger CSPs, and you talked earlier about there's different sizes of CSPs, the tier 1s, 2s and 3s, that the smaller CSPs maybe sometimes feel they can't contribute or that they haven't got the mass to do so. Is there a danger that they could be locked out of this?
Well, I don't think so. I think there are avenues for them to participate and contribute actively. I helped start OPNFV, this organization, a while back with a number of operators. And that was one of the specific reasons why it was created, was so that operators that traditionally developers were the ones with the loudest voices in open source projects. And operators traditionally were more focused on automation, DevOps, deployment, not actual development of the tools and the applications and that infrastructure that they needed. And their traditional model was to bring requirements to different vendors, and then the vendors would build the thing that they were asking for. That was a real gap when, as we were mentioning, the proliferation of networking in open source most recently, and organizations that were started like Open Daylight, for example, when we were building an SDN controller, operators would show up and say, how can we be part of this thing? How can we tell you what we need? And so organizations like OPNFV were created, and there's some other avenues in LF today. There's the CNTT effort that's happening. And so there's a big shift in the open source sort of ethos these days around bringing in their input and their requirements and then figuring out how they can best participate. Again, not just requirements, but perhaps in blueprint specifications like we're talking about, testing infrastructure. Network operators are great at testing things. And so bringing those skills to the party has been a real win for the whole community.
And Geoff, MobiledgeX is a Deutsche Telekom company, so you're in an interesting position here, having the CSP on one side, but you're engaged with a lot of developers. You're working with a lot of other operators as well, but you're looking at all these use cases and testing them out on the network. So how are you seeing things?
Well, what I think we start to see, which is very interesting, and I think the core of this discussion, is that open source doesn't mean free. Open source means there's different value created in different places. And if you're running any business, you need the business to work the right way. The question is how you make the business work the right way, and how do you best put a solution together. I think early days in the CSPs and the telecom world, and I'd love to hear if you agree, I think there was this connection that open source meant free. And then everyone turned around and said, give it to me, wouldn't pay for the end-to-end actual delivery. And then when it didn't work, people realized, well, actually, there were people who were making sure things worked. And that's very, very important. But there's a different way to make things work that's maybe in a more efficient sharing way. My sense is that through the different initiatives is starting to turn up. So the reference designs, there's a different approach to industrialization that now is maturing. that then allows a new model to work.
Well, let's ask our other guests what they think of that. Tom, let's start with you.
I was going to say that is actually what I was referring to is that kind of shift in the understanding of what open source is. It's not free like in beer. It's freedom in terms of seeing all the pieces, parts, and being able to participate and contribute. But then there's an integration thing at the end, because again, as I mentioned, most open source projects, even still today, are really not designed to be consumed from upstream into production immediately. There's always some sort of customization or packaging or whatnot that needs to be done, and it's understanding that and just making that part of the process that Geoff just mentioned. That I think that's an important change in the culture of SPs that's happening.
Timon, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, I would agree with everything it said. So a couple things to add. We've seen in even just the last year or less, some significant system integrators come and join the party, maybe you might put it. At ONF, we've had Infosys and Tech Mahindra join as top tier partners with us. And they're seeing business and revenue is starting to flow in this new model, and that's because operators do need help putting solutions together. And part of the strategy here is to essentially redeploy resources rather than buying complete solutions from traditional vendors that also traditionally had pretty high margins. They're redeploying all those resources to buy white boxes and to use open source and then to bring development resources. But often they don't have those developers on staff, and so integrators can play a very important and crucial role pulling all the pieces together.
Yeah,
that's exactly what I was mentioning about the tier 2 and tier 3 operators as well. That's exactly what I'm seeing happening.
And building on what Timon just said, we're working quite closely with an integrator called WWT. WWT is supply chain for the hyperscale guys. What they're really doing is industrializing different configurations and bringing that same economic to everybody else, be that tier 1, tier 2, and they're working with all of those. But I think this interesting balance of having freedom from multi-cloud, multi-vendor, multi-access, but managing the actual end-to-end economic supply chain with that same consciousness is where we start to see the market go.
Can I ask a final question to all of you? We started by looking at trying to understand the open source model for CSPs, and we've been discussing this, but technology is one thing, a mindset, a cultural mindset, an attitude from the CSPs is also required. Have we, the telcos, have we got the skills and the right expertise in-house to take advantage of what open source can bring us? Or is there still an awful lot of change that we need to make away from the pure technology side? Timon, we're going to start with you.
Yeah, happy to dive in on this one. So I think that it's a challenge and it varies operator by operator, and this is a journey as well. I'd say almost every operator does not have the skills and is developing it, and that's one of the reasons they're helping to bringing in outside skills in the form of integrators and others, but also recognizing that they need to develop these skills, and so it's a process and a challenge, and it starts by building sort of a core nucleus of expertise and then letting that build out in these operators, picking a project and starting to try to drive it towards market. But I would say all of the operators struggle with how to take and insert these new technologies into their legacy environments. And operators do have a history of these massive OSS BSS systems and wanting everything to really plug into it, and they're continuing to use that model, and that model does make it hard for them to really move at the speed of the cloud operators at the same time they're trying to emulate. And so there's definitely still tension there, and the jury's out on exactly how that's going to play out over time.
Tom?
Yeah, just to add to that a little bit, one of the other challenges that I'm seeing is I've seen a bunch of large operators hire sort of larger teams to build a certain product and in that OSS BSS model. And the real challenge that they discover at the end of that project is what to do with those developers. because they're not a traditional sort of cloud scale shop, so to speak. And so what happens then, and that gets back to the cultural changes that need to happen at these places, because there's nothing wrong with working at a telco SP as long as the environment is suitable and all that. And so that's really one of the things that's evolving, just to add to what Timon said.
And we're working very closely with all industries. One of the interesting things about this conversation is I don't think this is a telecom problem. I think this is every existing large enterprise that wasn't born in the cloud problem. And they're all sat there, and the number one challenge is, can I get the talent to actually understand what to do with this great technology to allow me to transform myself? A lot of those large companies absolutely are dependent on the promise of what the telecom is bringing, because they tend to be in many countries, they tend to be global, they tend to need to make sure they're compliant with local jurisdictions. So there's this massive melding pot that is happening where whatever we've seen so far, it's just going to get faster and it's going to get more immersive in all of our daily lives. So there's this 5G, I think, is going to be this. 5G is going to change the world, but we don't really know how, and we don't really know who is going to be involved in stitching that together. But that is the opportunity that's in front of us, and that's where we sit in the middle. We were set up by Deutsche Telekom to represent them and the other operators to try and model out that ground into something that's deliverable.
Big opportunity, but for now, Geoff, Tom, and Timon, thank you all very much for joining us on Telecom TV.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.